Welcome, everyone. We are absolutely delighted to be at this point in our conference. Where do we go from here? Revisiting Black-Irish relations and responding to a transnational moment by celebrating the work of and engaging in conversation, more importantly, with Ruth Negga. Kim DaCosta and myself will interview Ruth and reflect on, I think, many of the themes and topics that we've been touching on over the last 3 weeks, and indeed in this work more generally, building from the Black, Brown and Green Voices project. Born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and raised between there, Limerick, Ireland, and London, England, Ruth Negga is an exceptionally talented and versatile actress with a body of work that spans award-winning theatre productions, big screen historical dramas, independent films, and innovative television series. Ruth can currently be seen in Rebecca Hall's Passing opposite Tessa Thompson. The film is based on an adaptation of Nella Larsen's 1920s Harlem Renaissance novel of the same name that tells the story of 2 Black women, Irene Redfield, played by Thompson, and Claire Kendry, played by Ruth, who can pass as white, but choose to live on other sides of the color line. We're really, really proud and delighted that we're speaking to Ruth in the context of this film being released. Next year, Ruth will have her Broadway debut in Sam Gold's Macbeth opposite Daniel Craig, where she will play the iconic role of Lady Macbeth in this production. Previews for the 15-week show will begin in March. Ruth will next turn her lens to the titular role of the drama series Josephine, which follows the remarkable story of Josephine Baker, one of the most legendary jazz performers and civil rights activists of the 20th century. Most notably, Ruth was also seen starring as Mildred Loving in Jeff Nichols' Loving, inspired by the documentary The Loving Story. The film follows Mildred and Richard Loving, the couple behind the pivotal 1967 civil rights case, Loving versus Virginia. And for her performance in that, Ruth's accolades include Academy Award, Golden Globe, and Critic Choice Award nominations. She also won an IFTA Award for Best Actress in a Leading Role Film. On television, Ruth was last seen in her recurring role as Tulip O'Hare in the 4th and final season of the AMC series Preacher. Previously, she lent her voice as Mother in the beautiful animated program Angela's Ashes, for which she was nominated for a Daytime Emmy Award within the category of Outstanding Performer in an Animated Program. She holds a variety of US and UK credits. Most notably, I think for Irish audiences, many will remember her as Rosie in Love Hate for RTE and as Rochelle on BBC's miniseries Five Daughters, as well as playing Shirley Bassey in the TV movie Shirley, for which she won the Irish Film and Television Academy Award for Best Actress. Outside of her roles on screen, Ruth maintains a strong connection to the theatre, which we've mentioned in the context of Macbeth. And last year, she was seen in her New York City theatrical debut in the titular role for Yale Farber's Hamlet at St. Anne's Warehouse, for which she was nominated for a Drama Desk Award in the category of Lead Actress in a Play. This performance was following its acclaimed run at the Gate Theatre in Dublin, and it's actually through that I've had the pleasure of connecting with Ruth about some of the conversations we hope to embark on today. It's a real pleasure and honor, Ruth, and I now want to throw the conversation open to my wonderful colleague Kim DaCosta for the first question in this interview.
Thanks, Miriam. It's such a pleasure to meet you, Ruth, and to have a chance to talk with you about what I know are important issues to you as well. But I wanted to start with Passing because, it's obviously just released here and making a lot of news. But as I watched the film, I'm amazed that this is the first film adaptation of this novella, as far as I understand, which is amazing to me that it's taken this long. Someone who read the novella when I was 19, in college and remembering what an impact it had on me to sort of to see this experience or to read about this experience for the first time in my life. But it deals with a specifically American phenomenon, the idea that one can pass, which is only possible in a society in which you can be Black but look white, which depends on a really rigid system of racial categorization, right? The one drop rule. So one, I'm really curious about what your relationship to that phenomenon of passing was prior to doing this role, and also your familiarity with Nella Larsen's work, if you had that familiarity before taking on the role. And I'll start there, and I have a follow-up. But
well, yeah, I mean, since I was very young, I've had an interest in American history, primarily America's racial history, because I was curious about how modern America was shaped. And I was curious about slavery, how it happened, how it was excused, how it was maintained, why it took so long to be abolished, and the legacy of that period of time on America and how modern America has been shaped. And I felt like I wasn't finding any answers. I just felt it wasn't really addressed in any history books. And so I looked to literature. And I found it in initially Du Bois, Dr. Morrison, Dr. Angelou, reading a lot of Angela Davis work, and then Audre Lorde. And so that was sort of my education. And also within that, I felt a sort of belonging. I'd never been to America. I don't have any American connections, none of that. And but I still felt a certain sort of comfort in reading about people of color. And one of those novels was Nella Larsen's Passing. And I have to still now kind of reiterate that it was published in 1929, because so many people have seen the film and come up to me and haven't realized that. And they're quite shocked that it was written nearly 100 years ago, because I think how modern it is in its psychology, really, in its investigation of two women, but also the fact that so much of the ideas and the experiences in that book are relevant today and are still problematic today. And that sort of excites me, because I think that's where art and literature's power is in when it's really brilliant and incisive, it's timeless. And it also is a sort of, can be a guiding light, because through literature, you can shine a light on the shadows, the darknesses, the dark corners that we're often afraid to go. And I feel like literature and art is sort of a holding of one's hand to go there in a sort of safe way, because I think in order to excise our collective demons, we need to explore the darkness, what we've been hiding, what we've been shoving under the carpet. We need to integrate all of that to come out of, I suppose, a period of ignorance that is not serving anybody. So
what elements of it, oh, sorry.
No, carry on.
What elements of it do you feel are very contemporary? Because, you know, in the 21st century, people can be mixed race. They can, we no longer have the laws in place that made passing make sense as an individual strategy to live your life without or access opportunity. What elements of the story do you feel are really still resonant, and why?
Oh, I think so many elements are still relevant in myriad ways. I mean, strikingly, what leapt out to me is the conversation that Irene Redfield has with her husband, Brian Redfield, about talking to their young sons about racialized violence, lynching. That was a severe problem at the time. I mean, ever since the abolition of slavery and Reconstruction and the deconstruction of Reconstruction, the advent of the codes, the Black codes, which had echoes of slavery, Jim Crow, and a violent environment for Black people, and especially if you didn't follow these both unspoken social mores and legitimized segregation. And the couple are sort of fighting between themselves about, do we tell our kids this? Do we expose them to the dangers and the violence that is very real threat? And how long can we sort of keep their innocence intact, you know? And that dilemma is very much present now. I mean, we talk about the conversation, and the conversation is something that parents of Black boys in particular have to have about staying alive, essentially, in a world that it can be deadly for Black boys and indeed Black girls. So that, I mean, that jumps out at one when one reads it. But also, I mean, it's kind of radical now, but I mean, I can't overestimate how radical it must have been to have this sort of beautiful, complex interrogation of the interiority of a woman and a woman of color, two women of color. I mean, extraordinary. And the idea that our internal worlds are forever shifting, you know, and forever adapting and changing. And that makes us uncomfortable as humans, because we long for order and patterns and labels, you know, and we think that that's making us safe, you know, the binary. But it's really not. I mean, it's actually counterintuitive, you know, because it doesn't allow us to really live fully. And it also, when you live by those kind of rules that are so structured and really like unattainable, it can only create friction between you and the rest of the world. Do you know what I mean? Because we don't all have the same standards of truth, of beliefs. So, and I think what this book did for me is it sort of, it reminded me that how individual we are with our needs and desires and wants, and how each person is like a little gem, you know, and we all have different sort of beauties and ways of shining. And yet we're in a world that sometimes limits that and for these two women often limits that, you know, and the tension between, I suppose, I'm just talking about Claire really ostensibly, her need to shine and, you know, really explore all of herself and all of her desires versus the world she's born into that demands her to be one thing, and one thing only.
Fascinating. You know, when you were talking about the conversation and the relevance the film has to today in that regard, made me think, you know, I wonder what the reception would be like to the film had we not just gone through, say, the George Floyd watershed moment. You know, there is a way that conversation about the conversation became talked about in mainstream discourse.
Mm-hmm.
If you're Black in America, you know what the conversation is. We know what it is. We have to have it. But it wasn't the sort of thing that was broadly talked about. And so just the way you framed that just makes me think that this film in some ways is all the more timely. And the reception of it might be very different had we not, again, been through what we're going through with respect to racial debates and politics right now. I wonder how you understand the reception of the film in Ireland, if you have a read on that, given that there are some specificities culturally about the novel or the phenomenon passing. Do you have any sense of how that's been?
I don't, I'm afraid. No,
Yeah.
because I don't know how it's been seen there. I mean, you know, I haven't lived in Ireland in like 14, 15 years. And I luckily managed to visit recently with the film. It was shown at the IFI, so that was great. But I don't know, and it's interesting to me. I have no idea. Maybe Miriam can shed some light on.
I was thinking of the exact same question, Kim, when Ruth was talking there, in terms of actually when the film has come out. And I know enough about the production process to think that it's taken a while. The fact that it's come out this side of the George Floyd moment, to put it in that sense, rather than before, I think is really valid. But I wonder if I could tie that a little bit, Ruth, to my sense from you is, I mean, the you that we see in Irish newspapers or interviews and stuff like that. Are you more comfortable or more vocal about talking about your experience as a Black Irish woman and now than you might have been before? Like, I feel like we're kind of in this moment of reckoning. Do you have a sense of more freedom in terms of articulating because of the moment that we're in, because of, you know, the place you're at with your career and the microphone you have, or no?
No.
You were always vocal.
Well, I think it's a bit more complex than that, because I think, you know, I have my own fears and insecurities about different things. You know, I think I'm always loath to speak of myself just through the lens of being a woman of color, because I feel that's another way to sort of pigeonhole us. And I really resent boxes and labels. I feel I know we have this sort of instinct to gravitate towards them because we think it makes everything sort of easier, simpler, easier to digest. It really doesn't. Do you know what I mean? So while I can speak from, when I'm it's from a personal place, and it's me, and being a Black woman is part of my, but there's so much other things going on underneath there, like my shyness, my reluctance to speak for an entire group of people, my unique upbringing, you know, it wasn't straightforward. So I think I have a natural allergy to being a spokesperson for anybody apart from myself. I think that's why I became an actress, because I thought that this is the best way I can contribute with my body, because my body is quite, one's body can be quite radical just by living in it. To be Irish and Black, sometimes just opening my mouth is a radical move, because people just couldn't in the past sort of put the two together. It wasn't something that they'd seen every day. And the irony is that, you know, there's been Black Irish everywhere throughout the world for centuries. Do you know what I mean? So that's interesting, but also I think I felt like, for me as an artist, I felt always like words were not enough. I needed to, I wanted to sort of have a dialogue and speak with my body, my instinct, my intellect, cerebrally, but also with my heart and my soul. All of these different things is what makes an artist. And that for me was the best way I could. Every artist wants to say something. They're not always sure what they want to say. That's, well, my opinion anyway. And so by becoming an actor, I felt like I could become a conduit of sorts. And so when I'm being interviewed like this, I find sometimes it's not the easiest way for me, because it's quite a cerebral thing, isn't it, to articulate with words. And for me, I actually think I became an artist, an actor, because words were not enough. Do you know what I mean? And also they're so definitive, aren't they? And we're all changing. Like I'm constantly curious and changing my ideas and thoughts. And so I suppose what it is really is I'm a commitment phobe. I'm a commitment phobe, you know, because I'll say something today and tomorrow I'll think, oh no, I have a totally different idea. And I suppose that's why, I suppose it's like, you know, I love going to see dance, because to me that speaks on a different level. It sort of bypasses the cerebral and goes to the gut. And I don't think we have enough gut chat. Do you know what I mean? So that's a roundabout way of saying I'm just loath to be a spokesperson for anybody. And I'm loath from my personal experience. When I see it written down, it just is so, I feel it doesn't encapsulate my entire experience. And so I suppose I like the elusiveness of being an artist. And I like choosing projects that sort of are better able to articulate for me than I am as Ruth. And that's why I'm drawn to projects like playing Mildred Loving in Loving, playing Claire Kendry in Passing, because those projects for me say far more than I as Ruth could ever articulate. So that's a roundabout way of answering that question.
I mean, that's why you're such a wonderful actor. And I mean, I guess that is a nice way of, you know, kind of that's something that is interest. Kim had mentioned this question earlier about you taking on these iconic American characters or narratives. I mean, Josephine Baker next. Do you want to come in on that, Kim?
Oh yeah, I mean, this is what I find so interesting about your work, Ruth, because you have taken on these roles that I think for many of us in the audience watching, one, it's exciting to see these, be they historical events or important artistic works brought to a broader audience, but to share in the, or witness the interpretation that you bring to them. That's important to me and interesting to me. So I first became aware of you when you were in Love, Hate. And at the time I was like, wow, like one, I hadn't seen a Black Irish actress in anything, but I loved the character.
Me too.
Yeah. And so I've been sort of really interested in the way that in your performances, even beyond the fact that you're bringing to life these iconic events or people or lesser known but really important figures, is precisely what you were just describing. There's a way, you know, when you're, certainly as an academic, when you're writing, the temptation to kind of kill it with words, or the feeling that once you've written it down, it's like, ugh, does it really capture the phenomenon I'm trying to get at? And there are limits to language. There really are. So yeah, I guess, is there a question in there? I guess the question, you may have already answered it, but in some ways I was curious about kind of the choices you're making about those roles. Even as I would just found out that you were going to take on Josephine Baker, and I was like, how perfect. Mm-hmm. And yet I wonder like what you were thinking about in choosing that as well.
Choosing is such an interesting word, isn't it, in relation to being an actor?
Yeah.
Look, I was always ambitious to be a performer, you know, and it was weirdly enough through musicians that I fell in love with performance and sort of exploring the more extreme side of human beings. And it was sort of extreme, but I mean our subconscious, you know, our subconscious desires and sometimes a wish to sort of explore something that we may be, may not be. And, you know, when you're a teenager, that's a very interesting time to do that, because you're trying to figure out who you are and where your place in the world is. And for me, when I was a teenager, I was in London, and I was Black and Irish in London. It was the early 90s, and I had never felt so lonely in my life. And I just felt I was somewhere that I didn't belong. And now that was because occasionally I was made to feel that way, but also I didn't feel that this was where I was supposed to be. And I remember thinking, I never want to be anywhere I don't want to be ever again. So that was my only plan. And I remember thinking, but when I get to choose my own life, which is hilarious being an actor because so much of it isn't choice. But I thought, I want to do something like I used to see musicians on television. And it was Bowie, you know, Kate Bush, Prince, Hendrix, all people who were sort of pushing the boat out in terms of identity. And it's only making sense to me now that it was all about identity and about I realized that the only thing I wanted to choose was my own identity. I wanted my own identity because I felt like when you don't grow up as something clear cut, people are always trying to place you. And when they're in placing you and trying to place you, they're kind of imprisoning you in this idea of who they need you or want you to be to suit their lives for whatever reason. And I just have always sort of resisted that. And it was only when I was reading Audre Lorde, I came to her in my 30s actually. And this quote that I had to put whatever the book I was reading down, because, you know, when you read something that is so, you can feel it physically shift you because you feel seen or witnessed. And it's the quote about, if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crushed into other people's ideas for me. And I would die or disappear. That's not the quote, but you get my meaning. And I thought, this is what I've been sort of trying to do my entire life, is to, as a woman and a woman of color who has always sort of felt as I didn't fully belong anywhere, that I could, in response to that, be an architect of my own identity. And that sounds so simple, but when your identity is being discussed constantly, it's actually quite a radical thing, I think. So I think in terms of choice, that's really the only choice that I've made. Because as an actor, you sort of, there isn't choice, there's just choosing a path, surrounding yourself with people, trying to locate yourself in a world where you can explore that, explore identity, explore characters you wish to explore, work with people you want to, who you see as fellow artists on a similar journey, or in a journey that you will learn from. And that's the only thing you can really control. And the amazing thing is that, you know, it's brought me to people like Mildred and characters like Claire, who I feel aligned to and have been inspiring me in their form or in the form of others who are like them in many ways throughout my life. And for me to have the opportunity to play them, I can't tell you what that feels like. It feels like a spiritual alignment with my work. And I'm not embarrassed to talk about that, because I know a lot of artists and actors are, because we feel that it's sort of frivolous. It's too frivolous a job to speak about it in those kind of terms, but it's not. You know, artists are essential for the world. We're mirrors, and we sort of are Cassandras in some ways. You know, it's art and plays and films are a way to sort of live out our curiosities of how the world could be, should be, or how we don't want the world to be, you know. And also it's a way of, like, you know, the great thing about our film being on Netflix is it's going to be in people's homes. People, if they click on it and watch it, you know, this will be a world that people aren't familiar with and have never been. And yet it's something that I think is reminding us of our collective humanity, that we have, there's a universality to our experience. no matter the time, the place, the color of your skin, your gender, your sexuality. There's a universality in us. And for me, that's about belonging and feeling safe. And you can find that through the lives of others, you know, and spending time. And that's for me what art is. It's spending time with the lives of others. And I think that at its core makes us better humans.
Miriam, you're muted.
Thank you. Can I ask you, Ruth, I know you don't spend a whole hell of a lot of time in Ireland, but I think you're plugged in enough to get a sense that it's more diverse than the Ireland you grew up in. And, you know, by your example, the representation that you give, even, you know, when you don't like the labels and the boxes, and I get all that, how inspirational that is for younger people or aspiring people. My sense from you is that you wear that, you carry that not as a burden in a negative way, but you're conscious of that. Is that important to you?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, labels and boxes, look, in a perfect world, they wouldn't exist. And that's what I'm aspiring to, but I understand why we have them and why we use them. And I think they can be very useful in terms of identity. I really do. I think they can be useful in terms of making people feel less alone, you know. I do. I just think that it's when we use them to diminish or make smaller, then that's the problem. But I also don't think we should shy away from, you know, acknowledging who we are. Like, I'm a person, mixed race person of color, and I'm a woman, you know, and I'm very proud of those things, especially because they seem to be under attack historically. And even now, you know, I think what the last few years has shown us is that perhaps we were too complacent, you know, and that's not an admonishment. I think, you know, I understand why, because, you know, we all want to think we've reached this place where we've just progressed in this linear fashion and we're only moving forward. And I think this was a wake-up call the last 2 years especially, but also before then, that progress isn't linear, and it doesn't happen at, you know, at a metronome beat, you know. There's a syncopation, there's a backwardsness, there's a, you know, and that can happen at a rate. And I feel now more than ever that people are looking to labels and identifiers as a means of generating pride, generating being seen and being acknowledged. And so that's what we, using sort of labels and ideas about identity, I feel this is what we have to go through in order to be free, that we have to like go deep into who we are, who gets to choose our identity, who gets to legislate on our bodies, who gets to legislate on our right to vote. And so I feel that this is a time of embracing identity, but in a way so we can understand ourselves better, so we can one day aspire to leave it all behind and just be Now that's like wishful thinking, I know. But if we don't have something to aspire to, then what are we doing, you know? Because we can easily just crumple into sort of defeat. And I can understand that, you know, there's many days and hours and weeks that, you know, in the last few years, I think people have felt that, but what's not going to work is walking away from it or not acknowledging it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, this is a discussion I have with my students a lot. You know, a lot of them have an implicit sense that history is progressive. Until you point out the contingencies, you know, the things that, you know, don't necessarily turn out to be what you thought they were going to be in terms of some notion of progress defined by greater equality, for example. And, you know, on some level, it can often be jarring for students or a little bit scary, because the sense of like, yeah, but the world's just getting better every day, right? This will resolve itself. But part of what you're describing are the ways that, you know, sometimes to get that progress, people organize collectively on the basis of the thing that they were excluded upon.
Right.
In this case, race or gender. And I guess I wonder about what the possibilities are for this. In particular, there's a growing conversation about Black Irish people in lots of different places, right? Recovering the history. As you note, the many Black Irish people that have existed, but are disappeared because of the politics of the place and time that they were living, especially in the United States. And, you know, I have mixed feelings about the possibilities for that project. Like in some ways, as you describe, there is a kind of comfort, but also kind of excitement in recognizing what you share with other people, maybe across an ocean. But because of the traces of Irishness that in America that people like me have, but a recognition of a shared kind of struggle. At the same time, I personally get uncomfortable with the attempts to sort of ferret out DNA that says the corporate marketers tell you, oh yes, you had not even a person, you have genes. And that gets sort of elaborated as meaning something in particular. And of course, like any notion of race that kind of really is built on a sense of it's in your body and it's real and it,
Right.
You know, makes me nervous. I guess, again, is there a question in there? I'm just thinking about what the possibilities are for really thinking about, okay, this is what our history looks like. It's complex. It varies in different places, but there are these people called Black Irish who live now, also in different contexts, but are in some way elaborating that.
But you to Ruth's earlier point, you have to bring it out of the shadows, because for too long this stuff has kind of, right, not been in the mainstream narrative of what Irishness has meant, right? What that's going to mean over time, who knows?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, isn't it, about the body? And the Black body, which is visible. I'm sure you're familiar with Du Bois's term double consciousness. When you're experiencing life as you, but you're also viewing the world through the lens of, in this case, the white majority. And in Du Bois's case, the racist white establishment. So basically it's about being safe. So pedestrianly, it's walking into a room and thinking, am I safe? Or how has my body, my color, my hair, changed the energy and atmosphere in a room? How are they viewing me? You know, and so double consciousness is something that happens primarily to someone if they're a minority, right? So, and it's at its essence, it's about being safe. And I think African Americans are very familiar with that idea, and definitely Black Irish are in Ireland. And it used to really irritate me because I thought, why do I have to expend extra energy on checking my environs in a safe way, when I realized that that was something I was doing naturally, and when I read Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. So for me, the body is very important, and the Black body in history, and what it signifies in literature and art, and also how it's become, even talking about it, the body, depersonalized and sort of used. And that makes me deeply uncomfortable too, because anything that disallows the idea of a human being, an individual, worries me and scares me. Do you know, so you're going back to the conflict between labels and not labels, identity and everything. But I think for me, Josephine is perfect, really. She embodies the idea of how Black bodies make people comfortable and uncomfortable.
Yeah.
You know, because she, at the time, you know, I suppose, I think she upset people, both Black and white, for her embracing of her body as the nude, you know, because I think, you know, people were scandalized. And I think some of the, like, I suppose, Black bourgeoisie were scandalized because they felt that she was retarding progress by sort of being in touch with her body, you know, and, you know, there's the African drum beat and this association at the time that was base and lascivious and wrong. And I just love that she just dove right into it and embraced it fully. And then I think sometimes, but was that the only option for her? You know, and did she write her own narrative that made her comfortable with that, made her comfortable with showing her body to mostly white audiences, and the dichotomy of that, you know, and the complexity of that.
Yeah. At what point is she being objectified and exoticized in a way that
exactly
was counter to what ground she is breaking in other modes? It's
exactly.
funny when you're talking.
Yeah,
Sorry.
and how you can be, how much is she really in charge of defining herself, and how much is she conspiring, and how much is she just trying to have as much agency and control as possible, and this is the ways and avenues that she is using to her benefit because it's so limited. So that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
And you know, and I think, you know, what I love about Nella Larsen is that in her construction of these two women, and especially Claire, she's bucking every trend, every trope, every pitfall that you can think of, because her mulatto is not tragic.
Right.
Her mulatto has a joie de vivre, and she's a disruptor, you know. They all are, actually. Mildred was a disruptor. You know, just being themselves is an undermining of the status quo. Do you know what I mean? Like just being themselves and their presence, especially in terms of Claire. She's a destabilizing force, not just for Irene, but for the white establishment. Because if you don't know who's black and who's white, it sort of makes a folly of your racial rules, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, and I think it's very clear that Nella takes a certain glee in Claire's glee of walking the line, you know, of the danger involved, because it's dangerous. It was dangerous to pass, you know. I mean, you could be jumping from the fire into the frying pan. You don't know, because, you know, people pass because, not because they were going to have a jolly nice time being white. It was out of need and necessity, you know, and sometimes that need and necessity was to stay alive because your life was in danger. You know, the South at that time, you know, this is kind of in the middle of the Great Migration, when Black people were leaving the South in droves because of the violence and the limitation. And so that is the backdrop of this narrative. And so to have Claire sort of come from that, and I suppose choose a life which really she's choosing for economic gain and access, because it was so limited. So I think the thing is that you can never, it's impossible to demonize and judge people who passed, to me, and it's just impossible, because a lot of it was out of necessity. And in fact, what you're doing is you're cutting off a whole life. You know, many people never saw their families again. It's too dangerous. And I can't imagine the pain of that. And it's not a pain you can share, because you're ultimately living a lie, and lies need to be kept secret. And so with Claire, making her sort of this magnetic presence, with this sort of anarchic energy, is really something I think that she shares with Josephine, in that sense of these extraordinary women seeing the limitations that have been put upon them and really risking everything to push back, to live a life more fully. And that, to me, is so courageous and admirable. And I think, you know, that's just, and it just seems to be those women I'm attracted to playing. Then I'm attracted to playing them because they're so complex, and I'm huge admirers of them, but also because I feel that their stories have been neglected, discarded, erased, and not told. And so I suppose, yeah, I do feel a small part of me is sort of kind of on an artistic mission to sort of like resuscitate these narratives, you know?
Yeah. It's interesting that as you were speaking, I was remembering the scene in the film where someone in the living room party is like, have you seen Josephine Baker? Oh, you really must.
Yeah.
It's a nice linkage in terms of your projects. And I mean, I was going to ask about, maybe this is going too much into the weeds, but as you were talking about the risks of passing, it strikes me though that Claire's character, she's sort of, you know, when people pass, there is that exile from family, but she's already been exiled from her family, right? Her father's dead, her aunts, I think they might be dead. I can't recall now.
No, she goes to live with them because
Right,
she's
but
actually an orphan, and they're white ants, and they're very, shall we say, dismissive of her blackness.
yeah,
You get the feeling that it wasn't appreciated and therefore not talked about. And you just wonder, that's interesting in terms of being Black or mixed race and growing up in a very white atmosphere, environment. And if this is something that isn't talked about, then you sort of internalize that as something that is wrong and essentially wrong within you. And I think that's another thing of goes hand in hand with double consciousness, is that something that being Black and brown in a white world, that's what you're dealing with, an internalized sense of unequalness, an internalized sense of wrongness, an internalized senses of not enoughness, and you need to escape that.
yeah,
And that's what she does. And her avenue to escaping that is to pass. And yet she's walking in, known or unknown, she's a clever woman, to another sort of prison.
right. One of the things that many people who describe their experience growing up mixed race, particularly a generation ago, is that they felt they're living in the belly of the beast, as it were, because it's sort of racial logics very up close, right? Where you're dealing with sometimes the first experience of racism that you have is from a family member. It's not a stranger out there.
Yeah.
It's someone upon whom you depend for care.
Yeah, I've read about that a lot. Or a friend or a friend's family.
Yeah.
Du Bois calls it the lifting of the veil. And it's usually, he said the problem of the 20th century will be the problem of the color line. And it's so true. What really hurt me and shook me reading Du Bois when I was in my early 20s was the idea that many people's first idea of themselves as Black is through a negative experience.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's being called a name at school or seeing something derogatory on television. And if you're living in a very white world, sometimes you've got no one to go to, and no one, and as much as someone loves you or the compassion is there and the empathy is there, people are at a loss.
Yeah.
And so what happens to those feelings? Where do they go? And then race becomes something, your color becomes something that is, you associate with tabooness, wrongness, and if that's not addressed, then that internalized feeling can become hard and crystallized and really hard to expunge or expel or exercise, and some people live with it their entire lives and they can't name it, you see. And if we don't talk about it, then we can't name it. And if you can't name it, you can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
And I think in Ireland, we're only just talking about race in a way that people aren't embarrassed about, because so much shame and embarrassment about it, because people don't have the skills, or they think they don't have the skills to talk about it, and then you just don't.
Yeah.
And that was very much when I was a kid, there's just no discussion. I think people were they didn't want to say the wrong thing. They didn't want to hurt my feelings. And, at the same time, my family were very protective of me, but it wasn't discussed.
Yeah.
Because I don't think people had the language, there was nothing, it wasn't spoken of.
It's this sense that if we do speak about it, we threaten the bond somehow.
Yes.
Because there's this thing out there, we know we've crossed some important boundary here. The taboo is out there. In some families and we don't want to bring it in here. And so the strategy is, and therefore we don't talk about it. But the reality for children is there's no way out of it. And so if you're unable to speak this because you as a child, you'll understand that if it threatens the bond, then this is pretty tenuous. It gives one a sense of becoming very alert to where the boundary lies.
Yes.
What you can't, the limits within which this relationship needs to live. And
yes, therefore life and relationships can become unreliable.
Yeah.
And, you know, the thing about Ireland is that Ireland isn't saddled with imperialism, slavery on its earth. Do you know what I mean? In terms of color.
Yeah.
And so I feel like it's interesting to me to see how, you know, discussion about color and racism and who is Irish and who is considered Irish and not Irish and who's allowed to be Irish, this allowance. You know, who was the gatekeeper of identity, you know? You know, the most devastating thing about racism is when it comes from one of your own. And I remember being outside the Abbey Theatre and getting my picture taken, and this lovely older lady, she looked, you know, really like her granny and sweet, and she ignored me. She just raged the photographer, and she said, "Don't, why are you taking pictures of her? Go and take a picture of your own people, and there are enough of us for you to be taking pictures of." And my heart was broken because, you know, I'd experienced that in England, but that was okay because it wasn't English. But to have it happen in Ireland is devastating. And I was in my early 20s, you know. And that was very heartbreaking. And I didn't really talk about it because the shame. And I took the shame.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And what I want to happen is that Ireland has a very huge, big, glorious opportunity to talk about race and make sure that we don't hook the shame onto people of color, you know, or Irish, people of color, anybody of color. So we can look to history, look to other countries and see, that happened. I see where that we can avoid it. But it needs people behind that, you know, and it needs people to be curious enough to educate themselves, you know, to willingness to be educated. You know, I mean, and it's not that difficult. And I would hope that that's the direction Ireland is taking, but it won't happen on its own. Like we're talking about, you know, progress. You know, we have to shake this idea that it's linear and it's upwards moving and it's happening at a rate. I mean, even I, you know, have had to be disabused of that notion and keep disabusing myself of that notion. But it takes contribution and action. It's not, you cannot take, I mean, and I was guilty as anyone of going, great, I'm glad that program was made about that, or that person said that, great, that's done now. And, you know, I wish it was that easy, but it takes constant engagement, agitation. Do you know what I mean? Like disruptors. I think all artists are disruptors because they're changing something, they're moving something where, you know, it can be moving you to tears, or it can be moving your perspective, which I think is key in terms of inclusivity. you know, because we move a perspective nearer to one of empathy, you know. Hopefully we're compassion machines. Do you know what I mean? So that's how I can feel my contribution has been and is emerging. You know, it's all happening in flux. But it needs to be visible, you know, and engaged in, and if younger generations see us sweeping things under the carpet as taboo, then they will internalize it as taboo, and it will keep going, and the cycle won't be broken. Do you know what I mean? So it takes everybody, you know. Unfortunately, sometimes I feel that the people who inequality affects are the people who are required to solve the problem.
Yeah.
And that's just deeply unfair, and it doesn't work, you know, on our own. This needs, like, across the table, across the color line, across the gender line, collaboration. Do you know what I mean? It's not just a problem for Black people.
Yeah.
Not just a problem for Black Irish. This is about a country that has an opportunity to avoid the pitfalls that other countries didn't.
I totally agree with you. And I think that's what was so exciting for me when I first began to become more aware of what's going on in Ireland, because it seemed to me like you could do this way better than we did it here. And,
Yeah.
you know, it is inspiring to me to see young people who are trying to articulate what their experience has been in Ireland, but they're drawing on the experiences of the diaspora.
Yep.
You know, they're really trying to make use of
Absolutely
this past in ways that I think are really important. And to me, I think one thing I hope will be avoided is this hardening into camps, the sort of elaborating the distinctions between, you know, well, we're Black Irish and you're mixed race Irish. Or, and I'm not saying this is happening, but from my experience, it happens other places. Or also kind of to go back to sort of the family idea, the notion that, well, you know, if we just change our families and intermarry, that takes care of the problem, which has been a long-standing idea in American life, but also even in our academic life. And it's clearly not the case. It requires much more than that, precisely because families are complicated, as you were just describing. It's often a context of where these things don't get worked out. They actually get, actually, as you said, you know, sort of internalized by the very people who are kind of suffering the exclusion.
Yes.
So I appreciate that observation you made.
Ruth, thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, Miriam, such a pleasure.
Honestly, you've a lot going on and you're at the top of your game, and we'll be so prideful to see your name on Broadway soon. I mean, my God, by your example in so many ways. Thank you so much for doing this and for everything that you're doing in terms of championing all the labels we want to put on you.
Well, I know it means a lot to you as well, Miriam.
It does.
Your boys and your husband. Do you know what I mean? It's you know, we're at a pivotal point where Ireland can really show itself to be what I feel it is, a country of inclusivity and tenderness and humor, and unafraid to explore its darkness. You know, always in literature, but now in life more, and that takes a certain fearlessness, but it's entirely possible. And, I want to be part of it and contribute to it in any small way I can. And yes, it's kind of intimidating when you think it's such a big thing, in the world at the moment. It's still, what W. Du Bois said, he said, it's still in the 21st century, the color line. And it's only by acknowledging it and really going there, no matter how uncomfortable, because we can't keep kicking it down the road,
Mm-hmm.
But by your example, Ruth, in how you creatively are telling these stories on this huge stage, you're providing us with just such powerful tools, right? I mean,
it will be remembered and watched over and over again. And that matters.
Well, thank you both. Kim, thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
Such a pleasure to meet you. And I'm sure we'll cross paths again and again. I hope so.
I hope
Going
so.
anywhere, Miriam?
In Dublin. Let's do it in Dublin.
Oh, I'd love that. I'd love that.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thanks, ladies.